to the main website. Um, I know some of you guys are coming from Facebook groups or Slack channels or other sources. So Eugene, I think Eugene can share the main website on the chat. So subscribe there. That's gonna be the main way I'm gonna be communicating events, resources, and just anything uh, we're gonna do with web office hours. So this is gonna be recorded, and please drop if you don't feel comfortable getting recorded. Um, and if you have questions, just message that to Eugene via the chat. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. We cannot really open the floor freely because we had a few incidents before. So communicate with Eugene. He's the host of the Zoom call, so you can ask him questions at any time. And I think Mark will be happy to answer at the end. Um, so let me see if I missed anything else. Okay, recordings, the main website. Yeah, that's it. So thank you, Mark, for doing this, and I'll hand it off to you.
Cool. Hi, yeah, my name is Mark Noonan, and I talked to Paul, I don't know, 5-6 weeks ago about like maybe doing a talk with Web Office Hours and what kind of stuff I could talk about. And I've done some talks before about accessibility or about civic tech. These are things I'm really interested in. But I also mentioned just, getting onboarded and ramping up at your first ever job as a developer, which is something I did about 2 years ago when I moved from a nonprofit job to working full-time as a developer. And that transition, people focus a lot on the interview part of that transition, but I found there was a lot of stuff that I was learning on the fly once I was actually in the job that I thought would be good if it had been explained to me in advance. I had people who were able to help me at the job kind of get oriented, but I still think there's a little gap there in things that we don't quite talk about a whole lot. So that's kind of why we're here, and I'll just mention where I work and stuff like that really quick. So I'm a web developer at NextTrack. That's a company that's owned by Michelin, and we do telematics, so tracking vehicles and various other assets. And I'm a front-end web developer there, so I just work on the user interface to like maps and stuff where you're tracking vehicles. That's what I'm doing right now. I've been there for about a month, so I transitioned right when all this coronavirus stuff was starting to happen, which was pretty scary, but all has worked out fine. I'm a co-organizer at Code for Atlanta, which is an excellent place to be if you are like trying to enter into a web development job or some other developer job, because there are projects there that are really in the world trying to make a difference to various different kind of civic good groups, which is a very broad definition. And there's places there you can go and get experience and get referrals for jobs and stuff like that. So it's a really good place. I timed tonight badly. We have a civic hack night tonight that I'm missing for this. But usually twice a month, there's a civic hack night. We're doing them on Zoom right now. And there's a great place to go and get some experience and meet some other developers. And then relevant to tonight, I'm also a program developer at People Making Progress. Program developer is a title that we kind of made up a couple of years ago, right before I changed jobs, to allow for this weird little role that I wanted to still have at this nonprofit that I've been working at. And working at this nonprofit, I was doing a little bit more development stuff. I was doing some work in still kind of program development, which is a title you can have. And we worked at helping adults with disabilities in their home lives, but also in their jobs. So for about 7 years, one of my main jobs was to be a job coach. I would help people with developmental disabilities like Down syndrome or something like that, find jobs, get trained, get exposed to what they need to do for their job, and then work and kind of keep their job hopefully ongoing for years. So there's some experience that I had there with, hey, you're landed in a new situation. You have somebody who worked really, really hard to get a job, even though it might be in a kitchen or a grocery store or something like that. They worked really hard to get a job. They're not a traditional candidate, and they have to like find their way and make sure they have their place and kind of defend their place when they're working. And so some of that knowledge from that world kind of really helped me find my feet when I started, and hopefully will be useful tonight as well. So what I want to happen after you've seen this talk is just that you know more now about what to expect when you are trying to find your feet at a new job. You know more at the end than you did at the start, and that you should be a lot more confident that you're going to be able to do it and you'll be fine. And this goes all the way back to the interview process, where you have to act like you know how to do a job you've never actually had before. And you feel like you might have some skills that maybe come from a boot camp, or like me, I did a lot of learning on Free Code Camp. I knew how to put websites together and make things work. I didn't know a whole lot about how professional teams work and how we interact with all these other parts of a company. So there's a lot there, but a big part of this is it will be fine. And the more you know, the more confident you'll be in the interviews, and hopefully that'll help you. So what I did for tonight's talk was I just put a bunch of like situations or thoughts or things that happen when you get a new job into a big list, and we're just kind of going to go through them. If any of them spark questions, do reach out to Eugene and ask me the questions as we go. That's totally fine. And so we'll just talk about each one of those things, and we'll breathe and remember it will all be fine. There is a lot of overwhelm when you suddenly come into a new job, and it can look like a whole lot of different things. Sometimes you will have a mentor who can like be assigned to take care of you for your first little while and make sure that you know everything and everything is set up for you. Sometimes you go into situations that are a bit more chaotic, and the reason they're hiring you is because they're behind and they need help. And in those situations, documentation is probably out of date. A lot of things that you need to know probably aren't readily available for you. So it's helpful to feel comfortable asking questions and finding people who can help you, and making it known that you're really interested in getting the knowledge you need, and you're going to pursue that by nagging people until they tell you how to do your job and how to get stuff to work. So the first thing on the list is tedious computer setup using skills you never need in any situation other than this. This is a big part of like your first week of a job. You will have to get a local environment working on a brand new computer. People will be telling you to do stuff that you've never done and never needed to do. They'll be asking you to like do things that are 3 steps away from something that they haven't told you to do, but you have to do first. So it's just important to know everybody deals with this at the new job. Some places will have a nice written guide. When I went through it at my last job, I wrote a guide after I did it because it took me like 2 days to get my computer up and running. And the next person who came in after me, it took 1 day, and he improved the document that I made and told me, hey, you missed out this and this and this. So it is totally normal for it to be a real pain to get your stuff up and running. What I don't like about in this situation is that you feel kind of dumb, because the very first thing that they ask you to do at your job is filled with pitfalls, and you have to ask questions, and you feel like you're expected to know stuff that may not be related to the kind of work you're doing. It often involves like someone will say, oh, just put this in your path. And you'll be like, what's my path? I'm a web developer. I've never had to add stuff to that. I've never had to open terminal to do these kinds of tasks or deal with running a bunch of commands with sudo. So depending on the nature of your work, you may be really far removed from what it takes to get a development environment set up. And then once you have it set up on that computer, you will forget it after a month. And the next time somebody joins, you'll be helping them, and you'll be like, dude, I don't know how to do this either. Like that's totally normal. And so just give yourself a little bit of credit for being in there and expecting that that'll be difficult. And it'll pop up way more than you think. So I asked on Facebook in the Free Code Camp group, like, about this talk if anybody had specific concerns, and the one thing I heard was imposter syndrome. So goes along with this idea of, hey, your first task is going to be a really annoying thing that you're going to have a hard time doing, is that you're like going to start to feel like you don't belong quite often. People struggle with this their whole careers. But it's really easy to be fearful of that if you've come from another industry where the norms you know from that industry don't apply here, and everybody else seems to know what they're doing. And you also feel like everybody else has worked there forever. Um, Even though some people might be there just a month or two, at least I do, I feel like everybody has already worked together a long time and there's a system and I have to know how it all works. I think the important thing here is that people hired you on purpose. You went through an interview process. You were chosen to be the person that worked there. And they made that choice based on things that they were able to figure out about you during the interview. So they know that you have the skills they need. They know that you're at the right level, that you can learn how to work there and do well. They have faith in you and they intentionally chose to hire you. So they're not going to discover that they did the wrong thing. I have been, since I started, in the second half of the last year, I joined as a senior web developer and ran some interviews where I could see that people had gaps in their skills and I could see that people had things they were good at. And when we hired those people, I knew about the gaps and I thought they were acceptable gaps that the person could develop with and do well. And they were. Those were fine things to discover in the hiring process and hire somebody anyway and expect them to ramp up. And so people are doing this stuff intentionally when they're hiring. Imposter syndrome will just appear and you will worry that you don't belong, but remember that you do. So another thing that feeds into this is that when you're new to the job, in a really structured environment, you might have a week or two of training with like somebody to really, really gracefully explain to you everything you need in the right order. So you never feel like you're being asked to do something that you have no idea how to do or don't understand in the code you're working with. But my experience is that after a couple of weeks, you'll be there and nobody knows if someone has explained to you how the database works or if someone told you how to get on the VPN so that your API calls will happen successfully and not have a security problem. And so people will just start asking you to do things that you don't know how to do or that are related to something that you haven't been introduced to yet. And sometimes that's like how most of your training happens, where your job is to put up your hand and say, we haven't talked about that yet. I don't know where we keep our SAS variables for colors. I don't know how to do a build to the staging environment. And so it's completely ordinary to have different people just assume you've learned something already about the company you're working at. And what an employer will want to see from you is that you're putting your hand up in that situation. You're not struggling silently and you're just saying, hey, we haven't talked about this yet. And hey, by the way, you can count on me to put my hand up when I'm in that situation. That's really a positive sign as you're kind of learning your way through. So following along with that, meeting a bunch of new people and figuring out what everybody does and where you fit. So this is difficult. It's something you're going to have to deal with, but depending on the size of the company, it might be kind of hard. And what I really wanted to say about it was that we have an opportunity when you just join a company in how you approach getting to know your coworkers to really figure out like things that are helpful to you too. I think I say later, like to be a little bit cynical during this process. A lot of us will naturally ask people about their lives and about, hey, what do you do? What's your life situation, especially remotely now? It's hard to really get a face-to-face connection with people. And so some of us are just sociable and we will try to find that connection anyway. And some of us aren't. And it really, really helps if you can develop a little social connection with people even further away from your team than just you. And sometimes the way that you learn how things work is by talking to somebody who works on a database side of things, and you're a developer and you're asking, okay, so how do our two pieces interact? How does data get saved where you're working with it? And then how am I showing it from there in a user interface to somebody? But also just getting a sense of what everybody's personality is, their life, their family, just little kind of small talk introductions go a long way so that when you do have to inevitably ask a lot of people for help, you kind of know who each other are, and it's worth intentionally paying attention to that in the first few weeks because you can get overwhelmed by other stuff and kind of miss it. So learning a new code base is something you can approach all kinds of different ways. Depending on the nature of the job that you have and the kind of situation you're in, you will have like one big code base where most of your work happens, which is what I am working in now. But previously I worked at an agency where I did all sorts of work for different clients. And so we had many clients. They all had their own websites, their own code bases, their own setups, and their own history. And so I learned a couple things that helped me kind of get up to speed on what's going on in those other like repos of code that I think are helpful kind of going forward. So one of the things I learned to do is take a look at the most recent commits in something. If you have a Git repo that has a website kind of stored in it, take a look at the most recent work that's going on there, and you'll get a good sense of what's the parts that people are working on right now. This is stuff you can do on your own. You know, it's great if someone can give you a tour, but if they can't, you can do this on your own to just figure out where to look. You can see in the recent work that's happening what the code looks like as people are committing it, and a little bit about what the process is. Like if you see comments and stuff like that on pull requests, you can get a sense of how people are working there. But mainly you can see about this code base that might have a long history, who's working on it now, and what does their code look like? And do you feel comfortable writing in the same way that you see code written now in the code base? Is it different to what you're used to? And if it is different, be prepared to ask people, hey, you always use this kind of thing in JavaScript. Is that like your policy, or does that one person just like that? Those kinds of questions really help people explain to you what the actual culture is. And yeah, there's a few other approaches like exploring something. If it's a website, like working from the UI in the front and inspecting that UI and then looking in the code, like just generally searching for class names that are reflected in the UI. If you're asked to work on something and you're not sure where the code is, go and inspect it and see where that chunk of code is represented. And if it's in like Vue or React and there's components and JSX, you can sort of start to see where stuff exists. And then you have a way to ask questions to somebody that is real specific, like, hey, I'm working on this thing. I see this file. Is that the right place to make this kind of change? That can help you like get more knowledgeable quickly and have questions that are really specific when you need help. More tedious computer setup. It will not go away. It will be happening for the first few weeks. And they'll be doing some nonsense with Git at your new job that you've never heard of. So I'm assuming most people like watching this are doing some kind of development work and looking at like, hey, I want to get started in my first job, or I just got my first job. What I've seen in various repos that I've looked at is people have different approaches to how to do version control, what your commit messages should be like, whether we do pull requests, whether we have branches for every little ticket or branches for like every sprint. And the only way to know is for someone to tell you what the actual process is. And sometimes the process is not really documented. People just are in a pattern of doing certain stuff. So just be prepared that there's probably some culture around how commits are happening and around how pull requests work and branches work, that if no one's telling you what that is, make sure you ask and figure out before you do too much work that's committed. Make sure you know that you have an approach that makes sense in context, because like we said before, everybody may think somebody else told you how that works. So it's a really good question to ask.
Can I ask you something related to that?
Yeah.
When you're kind of joining the new team, like one thing we talk about imposter syndrome. I feel like I'm asking too many questions when would you say you're like asking too many questions versus like you should just kind of like make some decisions yourself and like sort of use your best judgment when you're starting out?
So
Have
I would
you
say,
ever like you know what I'm saying, like when you're joining especially if it's a big team, right?
yeah, I've never seen somebody I've worked with asking too many questions. So I'm not sure where that line is, because I always feel like asking questions is a really strong signal this
Mm-hmm.
person wants to do it right and they care about doing a good job. So I've been happier when we have had new developers who like ask questions a lot. It's great if they have a designated person that they know to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe you can feel out with that person what's too much. Um, but the other thing that's really good is to be focused on, hey, if I don't get an answer right away, I'm going to keep trying and I'm going to make progress.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good to know that there's a lot of things where you don't know the best way or the way that's conventional for this company to do this task. But you are able to say, get something working and then ask if you did it right. And what I've noticed about myself is I start out asking everything in advance, and then over time, I'm more, hey, I did something. Is this right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a little while later, I'm like, hey, I did something. Here's a pull request. Now comment and tell me if it's wrong, like as you get more confidence. Um, but if it's a question of like culture and what's the best way to do something, if you're able to get it working and you don't have an answer yet, I would say don't ever stop until you have an answer. Make sure you've sent the message to that person that you need some help, and then just keep trying if you don't have something better to do. I do really like it when I had a developer working with me who joined and she would Slack me and say, hey, I need some help with this thing. I can't figure it out. And I'd be in a meeting or something, and 2 hours later, I'd see a message from her saying, never mind, I got it.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That might have been something that if we worked together would have taken 10 minutes. But
Mm-hmm.
the effort that you see from somebody that's going to grind and keep on going um, is really great. Doesn't quite answer your question, but the
No, I think that was good.
it's hard to get to too much questions.
Mm-hmm.
If you're actually getting them answered, like you should have some work to do in between, I guess.
Thanks.
Um, so like, the other thing I've noticed looking at Jira, if you haven't had a job like this before, Jira is a sort of ticketing system with a board that a lot of places use. You can look at this virtual board with tickets that represent little units of work. And people assign tickets to other people, and you do something, and then you move it to a different column to say, hey, this went from like the to-do column, now it's in progress. Now I'm moving it over to QA and assigning someone else to check it, or moving it to in review. And there's always some quirks to that. It sort of comes with an interface that looks like it can't really be misinterpreted. You can file something as a bug or a task or whatever. But usually it means something that's not obvious from the surface. So at one group that I worked with, everything that was like needing feedback would not go to the next thing and be assigned to somebody. You would put it in a column called blocked and assign it to somebody. And when they were ready to work on it, they'd go take it out of blocked. Other places were like, hey, just move it over to this QA column and it'll be automatically assigned to the next person. Other places, it's all linked together with Git. And if you commit something and it gets approved, then it moves on its own through the process. So anyway, there's like culture around how the ticketing works that somebody should explain to you. And if nobody has mentioned it to you and you're working on tickets in a sprint and they're being assigned to you, that means it fell through the cracks, and you should have some knowledge from the people you're working with about what to do. So next up, I have Be a Little Cynical, which is just a reminder that you're starting a new job. You really want to have your job protected and make sure that not only you feel internally like confident that you're doing a good job and ramping up at the right speed, but you need to make sure that your boss or your teammates or whoever you're working with sees that effort from you and understands that you are trying to ramp up. Some places, and I feel like this is most places, there are these snags where you have to ask questions or you will just get stuck. The hardest things to ask questions about are the things that you're hired to do. So like people feel very comfortable asking about, hey, this is missing instructions in how I'm supposed to set up my computer. But if you're hired to be a front-end developer and you have your first ticket to work on is a CSS problem and you can't get it, like that's a much harder situation to ask the question on. And it's tempting to get stuck on that. Um, but I would suggest please do ask the question, if for no other reason than like people who are observing you are going to see that you're making the effort and the wheels are turning. We all need a second pair of eyes sometimes. It's totally normal, no matter how much experience you have, to get stuck on things that you think should be easy. Um, but stuff like connecting with your coworkers and just if there's not a natural way for your boss or whoever to know that you're doing fine, you kind of have to create one somehow. Um, that's different depending on the situation, but be cynical enough to know that um, it's useful to have all your progress be visible. From a purely mercenary, you want to make sure that you're seen to be successful in the job. Um, if you aren't already motivated by just wanting to be good and that that level of communication is the best thing to be doing for your actual success. This is an expression I love. Asking for help is a superpower. I've seen it a few places. I don't really know where it comes from. But when you are stuck, asking for help is really the fastest way to get something done. And like I was saying, it shows that you want to get work done. So a lot of us are able to grind through and get something to work and struggle and make things happen. But if you can be humble and explain that something's not clicking right away and ask for help, it doesn't just communicate like you might think communicates, hey, I'm incapable of working on my own. It can also communicate a sense of urgency that you've been given some work to do and it's not going great right now, and so you could use a little help. And then, if you're not totally blocked, if you're able to try again, or you have a different process you can do, you can go and do that while you're waiting for some response to get some help. But it really can often make things go a lot smoother. And in the process of someone helping you, you learn a lot more about kind of how the code base works and how you're supposed to contribute stuff and what a good solution looks like to the people you're working with. And that's kind of important. So more tedious computer setup skills. This is a big one. I think that connected to imposter syndrome is this feeling like, oh, I'm at work, it's a new job. I'm frustrated all the time because it's really hard. Dealing with frustration is your job as a developer. It's so difficult sometimes to get stuff to work and you want to throw your computer away and you want to go and do a whole other job. This understanding when you are frustrated and when you're not being productive because you're like debugging and something's not working and you're really annoyed. If you're able to recognize that feeling in yourself and take a breath and step back from it, that's really a strong skill to have. And I don't think we sort of talk about the benefit of being able to be patient and handle frustration. But if you're able to I get cranky when I'm frustrated and I feel like hot and I start trying things where the only thing I'm doing different is I'm pushing the button harder when I refresh the page, or I'm logging out stuff that I know is not related, but I'm just kind of just a little bit desperate and I'm trying things. At that point, you've kind of stopped thinking logically about the problem and you're just hoping to discover something by trying various toggles. And to me, that is that's a state where you're probably not going to be productive. And if you can take a break, if you can take a walk or do something else or get a second pair of eyes on it, everybody who you're working with knows what that feels like. Everybody's been there. And so if you're just going to tell someone, hey, I'm missing something. It's not like, hey, I don't know how to do HTML. Hey, I'm missing something. That person's going to come along and maybe in 5 minutes they'll just say, oh, you're refreshing the wrong link. It doesn't build to that. which is a thing that I do a lot. Or you didn't include the file, so your code that you updated is not there. Like, these are real simple things that someone else can see for you if you're frustrated like this. But if you can learn to see when it's happening and stop yourself for a minute, you'll save a lot of time. Which is why I think debugging is really important when you are starting a new job. If you are coming into a development job for the first time, let's say you've done the interviews, you have an offer, you've accepted your offer, you're starting in 2 weeks. I would say getting good at debugging in the environment that you're going to be working in with the languages you're going to be working with is massively the most useful thing you can do. Understanding, if you're a web developer, how the browser dev tools work, how to set a breakpoint in JavaScript and discover what something is doing and step through the code. There's a lot of great videos about how to do this, and I still know people who, like, in order to debug JavaScript, need to console log things and need to play with the source code. But when you're in this job for the first time, you're going to be needing to discover a lot about something that you've never worked with before, about some code you didn't write that you don't have any sense of how it works. And so you're probably going to be more challenged to debug and learn about code through inspectors and through dev tools than you would have been in working on your own code. So when I started, I had mostly done like civic hacking projects with Code for Atlanta. I'd done some freelance work for friends and family, and I had done some work at People Making Progress, where in all these things, I was basically coming up with the project, writing the code, sending it to somebody, asking them to approve it or pay me or whatever. But I was in control of the whole process, and I really didn't have to work on stuff that was not mine. So when I went to Content Thread, we had a developer called Nate, who was our technical director. And one of the first things he did was show me how to go from looking in the user interface, finding something on the website that we were working on, and finding that same thing in the code base of this like really large website with thousands of pages and a whole content management system behind it. And his ability to like go through and read through code and play it in his head really made it easier for him to understand what was going on in these complicated sites, and showed me that like how to use those tools is very helpful. And when I just recently changed jobs, the experience of being better with dev tools and debugging was vastly different to when I started at the first job, where like if someone mentioned something for me to work on, I can immediately take a look and figure out what component it is, and at least get to the right file and then ask questions about the code. It's been hugely useful. And so I wish I had gotten better at the debugging experience earlier. So this is just general advice. Make a lot of notes. You have this resource when you start working somewhere of totally fresh eyes with no preconceptions about what's normal or what's supposed to be going on there. And it's not great to, in your first week, ask everybody why they're doing everything this way. That could come across kind of aggressive. But if you notice things that are in the code that are looking weird to you based on what you learned at boot camp or based on what you think should be going on, if you see stuff like missing tests or missing documentation or out-of-date comments or all sorts of code commented out that should be there, you make a bunch of notes, because some of that stuff can come back later and be useful for you to actually work on yourself if people aren't sure what to do with you. And also the idea that you're like paying attention to things as people are explaining things to you, and you're paying attention to things as you're working in your code, and your questions are the kind of questions that come from, hey, I've been studying the code base, or I've been trying to do this thing, I'm pretty deep in it, I want to understand it better, I want to do it right, here's a question. Like that's a question that reflects really well on you, even if people don't have time to answer it. And in terms of like being a little bit cynical, if you are able to make some notes as you start of stuff you might want to fix or improve or suggest improving, it will help you come up with something when you're expected to say anything in a meeting. It'll help you come up with something when you get through with your tickets, but it's like early enough in the sprint that you should be doing more work. If you can be seen as somebody who took some notes and is like, hey, I've got an extra day left, my tickets are done, how about I add tests for this component that doesn't have any tests? That really helps people to see you as somebody who is attentive to their work and wants to do a great job and go above and beyond. Even though all you're doing is like harvesting notes you made in your first couple of days or first week, it it helps you portray the fact that you're interested in your work and you want to do well, and also helps you do that. So I don't like portraying things that aren't true, but if there are things that send the right signal to the people you work with and are the right thing to do, they're like doubly valuable to you, and that's worth emphasizing them. I have seen meetings where new people are too shy to say anything, and I want to say it's okay to mostly hang back, but contribute something if you can think of something that's worth saying. I used to have a like internal policy in meetings where I would only talk if I thought that I could somehow make the meeting shorter by talking. If people were going down a rabbit hole and I thought, I would say something like, hey, aren't we going to not address that until 2021? And then we'll stop talking about it, and the meeting would get a little bit shorter. Because I used to hate them and I used to feel kind of exposed in meetings. But if you have a couple things you can say, or one question you can ask, or something you can offer, just to show that even though you're new, you're engaged and you're making the effort, those are the employees that people really value, that you're trying to put everything through your brain and come up with what does it mean. And in trying to do that, you have a response or a question. You're not sitting there passively. I think that's the one mistake you can make if you're new, is wait around for people to tell you things, for people to give you tickets to work on, wait around to be told or asked directly in a meeting to contribute. Anything that makes you seem that you are purely passive and will do the bare minimum is to be avoided. I think it's one of the only real mistakes you can make, because if people don't feel like you are invested in trying during your work time to make the most of what you're able to do, it reflects badly on you and makes the relationship feel like people are trying to drag work out of you. And I haven't seen that very much, but I have seen it once or twice, and it's sort of sad, especially if someone is really, really actually making an effort and they just don't do it in a way that surfaces the effort that they're making. So this carving out your job idea comes from my job coaching experience, where often you would get someone hired on a certain job description. They're going to work in a kitchen. And when I worked with people with developmental disabilities, a lot of the people I worked with were not fully equipped to do every possible task in a dish room. They may have been able to do 80% of the job, and there were some things that were too dangerous to do independently or required a level of judgment that they didn't have. And so we'd work with the employer to come up with this like carved out job description that fits that person and lets them do what they're really good at and avoid the stuff that's not right for them. And I kind of realized this happens all the time in other jobs as well. No matter what the job description says, like, you're going to be working with what the business needs. So whatever you've been hired to do, you're really in some level in control of the job you end up getting and working on, like the actual work that you do being a subset of what the job description is. And you can emphasize things that you're good at, and so try to make your job more towards what you're good at, or stuff you're interested in and want to learn, stuff that you think is missing. So let's take the team that hires you because they've been shorthanded, and so they've been cutting corners for 4 months while they waited for the right person to come along. And now they have to catch up on documentation or something like that. So you can find things, if you're looking for them, that become part of your job and part of your responsibilities. By realizing that the job description, once you're hired, doesn't matter a whole lot anymore, and you're going to find areas where you can contribute. And if you see stuff that's currently no one else's responsibility, if you can find a way to grab that as a job that you do, that's great. That slots you into a place where you're needed, where people might not have even realized that you're needed yet. So it's really good if you can spot those things. This is the other thing that you really have to believe. So I mentioned this earlier. No matter what you're working on, usually you're going to be able to do it if you really, really have enough time. And your motivation for asking for help is not because you physically can't get this thing to work. Your motivation is it's not worth spending the time for you to learn Java all of a sudden to make some changes in the back end. You need to realize that's a task that's not really for you, pass it off to somebody else, ask for help. If there's a bunch of work in a framework that you've never used before, you need to learn that framework if your company is using it. So you probably need to do these small changes that should take 10 minutes slowly because you have to do something to expose yourself to how React works if you haven't used React before. So it's not a problem for that to happen. But you shouldn't think, because I haven't used React, I need someone to step me through every part of this. You're a developer and you're going to be able to do stuff no matter how long it takes. You're going to be able to grind through and get something working if you have to. And you'll need to lean on that if you have, for example, someone goes on vacation 2 weeks after you join, and you're the guy who has to fix the bug that came out of nowhere. That's like going to fall to you, and you'll have to grind through it potentially on your own to get something working. And so that exploration is normal too. If something's taking a long time, as long as people know your status, that you're working on it and you could use some help, but nobody can help you right now. So you're just learning what you need to know and doing it. That's a normal pattern that you will see no matter how experienced someone is if they're working through something they haven't worked on before. That is legitimate. And if you're being asked to do something that you've never done and there's nobody available to help you right now, it's totally fine to say to the manager, whoever's asking you to do this, I can do that, but it's going to take me a while. I got to learn some stuff, but we'll get there. So if you don't need it today, give it to me. If you do need it today, give it to somebody else. But you have to believe that you really will get there. You have to believe if someone said this API is not returning the right data when you hit the servlet, that you could find the Java that represents that API and toggle some stuff in there. Even if you've never written a line of Java, that you could go to get basic tutorials and figure your way out how to make that work if you really had to. And so that's, how you, if you're in this position, became a developer without having a background in that when this is your first time doing that job, and it's the ability to just push through and get stuff to work. And yet again, more tedious computer setup using skills you never use in any other situation. So those are all the things that I could think of. I feel like some of it, as I was saying it, feels a little bit obvious, but I don't know that 2 years ago that stuff would have felt obvious to me. So I hope that at least some of these things were kind of useful and make you feel a little more comfortable with the things you might expect to have happen when you get a new job. I'm totally happy for any questions you would have.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to message me, and I can ask Mark. I have a few here lined up that were sent to me. In terms of some of these ideas, would you say there's a difference between when you're working with bigger teams or smaller teams? Are the expectations typically mileage may vary when you're working on a bigger team where things tend to maybe move a little slower versus a smaller team where much more I guess the work, in my experience, smaller teams seems to be moving a little faster, so you kind of get a lot of stuff thrown at you and you expect it to kind of deliver very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's true. So my experience is one relatively small team, and then just moving to a bigger team, which is like a team within a team within a team,
Yeah.
where there's a lot more layers before it's decided that work is going to get done on something. So there is definitely, like, depending on the culture where you're going and the speed at which people work, for sure, there's some different expectations. I think that even in a place that moves very quickly, um, you're still not expected to know things that you don't know and magically produce work. But I think you have to, like, stand up for yourself and say, you're asking something of me that is a big swing for me right now. So um, if we're that busy and we're going to try and do it, then that's fine. We'll try and do it. But if you're working in a place that expects kind of magical things of you right away, that's a pretty difficult situation to be in, and all
Right.
you can do is your best.
Right. Right. So how would you say, like, is there an expectation for when we're talking about a junior developer that's just starting out, maybe first developer job versus someone like uh, advanced or like mid-level? Would the expectations kind of be a little different, would you
So
say?
I would say so. Yeah, I was thinking a lot in this talk about someone coming into what would effectively be a junior position, where this is your first time working as a developer, so you aren't familiar with how teams use Git and how teams use project management software, because your last job was, like me, at a nonprofit or in a solo development environment. Um, I do think when I've been around and senior developers have been hired, or in my new job where that's a senior role, um, the expectation is, like, you do know at least how software teams usually use those types of tools, and project management in general works, and maybe how, like, agile works as a concept, even though agile doesn't really happen by the book most places. But this idea of, like, how sprints work and everything, there are some typical things that go on that you would expect a senior person to have worked in various kinds of environments that use those pieces of culture. But I would expect a junior developer to maybe never have worked in sprints before, and
Mhm.
never had, like, to make commits in a specific way, following a format, or do pull requests. I would think a junior person should be pretty good at, like, working on the code itself. If you're a junior front-end developer, you should be pretty good with HTML and CSS and some JavaScript, as in getting stuff done in those languages. But probably wouldn't expect that the person coming in for the first time has worked in teams, unless they've done a bunch of civic tech or open source work, where that's how it works.
Mhm.
Otherwise, yeah, expectations be pretty low on the work skills outside of coding for a junior developer.
Right. One thing you pointed out, which I think you nailed it, is the idea of, like, asking a lot of questions and, like, even admitting where, like, you don't know something, or you're struggling getting something up and running. Because I used to think that when you're brought on, especially when you start, you're supposed to know everything, and that was it's a temptation to try to pretend everything, and I think that's where it can get more stressing, because it reinforces the imposter syndrome, because you are projecting that you do know everything but you really don't. So I think that's very important, and I made that mistake early on in my career.
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
as I used to do interviewing, as I started out, like a few years after I started at my previous company, and one of my pet peeves was when during the interview, I would ask a question that somebody didn't really know exactly, but they would try to, like, make up stuff to see if they get it right. And that was my biggest pet peeve, because it's like, it's okay to not know, we're not trying to see if you know everything. We're just trying to engage sort of like
Yeah.
how you think. Um, that's good. So let me see here. One of the things that sometimes happens when you join as a junior developer is, like, you are pointed to a document that kind of shows how to onboard set up your environment, the process documentation. And oftentimes it's usually outdated, and it's hard to like make sense of it, or it's impossible to try to make it work, but you still pointed to it because that's kind of like where over the years people have tried to keep it up to date. What's the best way to deal with that problem? Maybe not from like the person trying to set everything up, but just as a culture, how do you keep up to date this kind of stuff that you kind of touch once in a while, right? When somebody joins.
So I liked to tell the new people, here's a document. It's out of date. Please get as far as you can with this document. And then when something doesn't work, call me and we'll work forward from there. And together we'll update the document, or we'll figure it out. And then you as the new person will update that document. And now you're the expert on onboarding the next person when they need help. So if you are, if one of the first things you do, if you get an out-of-date onboarding document and like it doesn't work because the version of Node you install is like this year's version, not the 5 years ago version that the document was referring to, or something like that. And if you're able to say, hey, I needed to do X, Y, and Z different to the documentation, so I updated it, here's the new file. It's an amazing thing to do, like in your first few days joining somewhere as a junior developer. If they're able to keep that document like version controlled, and you can make your first commit be this kind of documentation, you can learn a lot about their process with how code is worked on as well. That's a really, really good thing to do as a new person, to say, I use this document, it was garbage. Here is a new version of it that has the steps I had to take, that I had to get from these 4 other people.
Right. Yeah, that's usually the way it is. Kind of messaging various people to try to get set up here. So it looks like Paul had to drop for a little bit, but he's back. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, so what's hard is when you get that document and you feel like the idiot because you're doing all the steps and you think you're missing something, and it's not. It's just that it doesn't work that way anymore. Like IT changed something last month, and now your VPN is different, and so you can't get access to the stuff. So it really is a rough thing. Like I do admire companies that have a full-on 2-week training system where you don't even touch real code for a while. Like you just learn how you're supposed to work there. But I definitely have only heard of that at bigger companies with like big engineering focus.
Okay. I have another question here from one of our participants here. Are there different workflows at different companies? And how do I maneuver learning new workflows?
Cool. Yes, from what I've seen, this was what was helpful about working at the agency I worked at, was we were connected with lots of different companies and their workflows. And so I could see a little window into how work was getting done at like 6 or 7 different places. And everybody has a different system. Everybody uses tickets a different way. Everybody uses Git a different way and has different expectations. So the only way to really address it is you're not going to learn that from looking up how agile software development works and expecting that your company is following that whole process and doing like Scrum and sprint retrospectives and all these things that are like rituals that go with that. And you might think, okay, they say on the job requirements you have to do Scrum, and you get there and it's really not what they do. They do like some modified version of Scrum or something that looks like Scrum because people like Scrum, but isn't really like working in the way that you've seen written up. So all you can do is like ask your manager or your buddy. If you get assigned a buddy when you start at a company, that's fantastic because they're the perfect person to ask questions like, how do I even do the work? Like how will I receive work that's coming to me? Will tickets be assigned to me? How will we do sprint planning? Understanding that stuff that's like air in the company that they're just all used to, they're going to forget to tell you. And if you don't ask about it, you're going to be confused by what the expectations are.
Mm-hmm. I have a loaded question here, so I'm going to try to sort of summarize it a little bit. When it comes to like, bringing new developers, what habits do you have to break new developers of perhaps, oh, well, hold on, let me try to say some of
Sure.
the pronunciation stuff. So what habits do you have to break new developers of that perhaps can be worked on prior to starting at a new place? So I think if I'm just understanding correctly, um, before you start at a new place, right? How can you prepare in, getting all this thrown at you?
So it's a little difficult if you've asked in the interview, what's a useful thing for me to work on. I was able to learn some specific technology things that the companies that I was working with were doing, and I was like, okay, they mentioned they're using D3 for charts in this one part of the thing they showed me in the interview. And I'm like, I should probably brush up on D3 and how to do charts in JavaScript. So I spent like a whole weekend taking a course on D3 and how to do these things. It didn't come up for like a year and a half of working there. The thing they showed me in the interview was just one of their many projects, and I didn't need to know D3. D3 is hard. I
Right.
regret the time I spent learning it. Hasn't really come up. And so I think if you know to ask these questions, they can probably direct you to a couple of things. A lot of companies, especially bigger companies, will be like not really inclined to put work on your plate before you're actually working there. And they really shouldn't expect that you've done a bunch of prep between the interview and your first day, because that's not time that they're paying you for. So
Exactly.
there's not a huge expectation. But if you can get bits of information about what's useful and you have the time, you can be led by what they tell you in the interview, or just expect, like I was saying in this earlier, debugging is the thing that I would spend all of my time on in the preparing, because being able to figure stuff out on your own with like Chrome DevTools or whatever the programming paradigm you're in, whatever its debugger is, where you can play through code and explore, that will help short circuit a lot of the beginner questions that you might have. And so brushing up on how to interact with the language and discover things is amazing.
Great. And if I could add a little bit to what you said, during the interview process, it really is a great time to ask about the technology that's kind of, used around the different tools that they're working on. And I think it really engages the company a little bit, because I don't think a lot of people do ask that. They kind of go into an interview just kind of wanting the job. But if you sort of interact with the interviewer and like talking about the product and the development, cycle and sort of the processes that they're using, I think it really engages them a little bit, and it shows that you actually are interested in, the process.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, you apply for a job. If it's a front-end position, one of the things that the companies do, they'll just put every technology that maybe they have touched over the years, and then you look at this job description and you see all these technologies, you're like, wow, I got to learn all this, but you're really not expected to be an expert in all of those technologies. And a good developer would not necessarily know all the technologies, but they would have the tool sets to be able to pick up anything as needed and to get comfortable with the technology. Like React, I've never used React, but I'm pretty sure in the weekend or a few days I can get comfortable enough to dive into a project. Maybe not as a lead, but definitely to support the development of a React project. So I think that's kind of the expectation a lot of times of developers like us to be able to pick up things and get the ball rolling as quickly as possible.
I'd actually love it if I was in an interview with somebody for a junior position and their resume said, hey, I'm a self-taught developer. I worked with Free Code Camp or courses online. And in the interview, they're like, hey guys, what is your branching strategy for Git? I'd be blown away by them even thinking to ask that.
Yeah, that's great.
I would hope I would have a good answer, but I do feel like that would signal this person is strong about trying to understand how to work here.
Right. And I think those are the best kinds of interviews, it's conversational, that's, it's not like a Q&A, questions and answer, and you just kind of try and get the answers correctly. Yeah, that's excellent. So if you have any more questions, feel free to send them through to me in the chat. Looks like we're a little bit past the hour. So Mark, what is the best way for people to connect with you?
Oh, I meant to
Do you
put
have a
that little thing in
do you
my
have a
slides.
LinkedIn or Twitter or anything
You'll
that?
find me on LinkedIn just as Mark Noonan. On Twitter, I'm at Mark T. Noonan. That's the easiest place to just like find me, and I'll follow you and you can ask me questions. That's totally fine. Yeah, Twitter and LinkedIn are totally fine.
Cool. And do you have any public projects that you are involved in as far as
So
open source? Or
I
you
have,
primarily React, right? You're from the React community primarily?
I'm mostly Vue actually.
Oh, Vue, okay.
I sort of, yeah, I think I mentioned React a few times because I didn't want to be biased towards the one that I and I feel like more people use React. But I have some projects that are through Code for Atlanta. One of them is freelivetranscript.com, which does kind of like what we're seeing in the bottom of the screen here. Before I knew this existed, which was intended for this exact type of situation where you want to have transcripts appearing as someone's talking. That's a slightly out-of-date Code for Atlanta project that I haven't worked on in a while. But I've, like, through Code for Atlanta meetups, I will contribute to various things. And there's also a website called autismactivities.ie, which my sister runs that I created. And that's a great place if you know anybody who is autistic in Ireland and wants to know what events and stuff would be good for them. That's a good place to look for that. And I think that all of that is open source as well. Don't look at the code for free live transcript. It is very bad. Very, very bad.
The beauty of open source, huh?
Yeah, you can write speech recognition software in a weekend when you're stuck at an airport. Yeah. So,
excellent. So, okay, we don't have any more questions. Looks like coming in. So, Paul, do you have any closing remarks or announcements?
Yeah, so I had to step away for a sec, but thank you, Mark, for doing this. And again, go to the website and sign up to the mailing list. I'm gonna ask Mark to share some of the stuff, some of the websites, his links, and so that way I can distribute that to all you guys. I had one question, Mark. It's a fun one. Where do you see the industry going for us, like coding wise? Like, are folks leaning towards more, I don't know, JavaScript? Is that what's gonna be used across different, I don't know, devices or even cars? Or like, I'm kind of wondering, what is your, like, yeah, like, what is your take on that?
it's hard because I definitely I've bet the farm on JavaScript at this point. Just in terms of my own learning, I haven't studied much other languages except like a little bit of just enough PHP to get by and stuff like that. So, like, I'm comfortable there's enough JavaScript work coming,
Yeah.
and that it'll keep showing up, even though it's probably not the thing that should be controlling cars and stuff.
Or missiles.
Right. No. Yeah. I would like fewer undefined does not a function errors in missiles and cars.
Turning back to base.
But I do think like more of the JavaScript work, or at least the web work, is going to be in supporting like content management systems and no-code tools like Webflow, where you're gradually making tools that help other people to make websites without code. And there's a huge amount of work to be done there. And in the sort of world that I was in before, in the agency model, we worked with a CMS where my job was not to make like the website from a design, it was to make components from a design that would be stitched together into a content management system that the client would then use to arrange their own website and publish that website. And so I think no matter what training you're doing in web development, if you're able to work with some kind of content management system and show not just you can build out the HTML that goes with the design, but you can work with something like Storyblock, which is the t-shirt I'm wearing, or a couple of other places, that you can say, hey, I know how to make pieces of a website that someone can stitch together on their own to build a page. That is a level above, hey, I can make a website. And whatever, whether it's WordPress components or anything, like I don't know how everything works, but where you can do that is where I feel like the work is coming. Very little bespoke websites that you make for a small business, like a restaurant where you just make 6 HTML pages and you're done. More making systems that other people can use.
Right. It's
Cool.
definitely a more philosophical question, right? where the future's gone here with JavaScript, but it's definitely an amazing ecosystem to be in right now.
I just want to know if I'm safe, man. Job security.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So thank you, Mark, again for doing this, and thank you everyone for joining. And we'll send a video recording via email. It's gonna be a link to the actual main website. So I'm gonna be posting all the recordings that we have done previously in there. And stay tuned for the next speaker. I haven't really decided what topic precisely, but if we don't have one, we might be doing Tailwind. So just stay tuned for that one. And again, thank you, Mark, for doing it.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone, and I hope you all have a great rest of the evening or morning, since we're all from all over the place. Have a good one. Bye bye.